This was something I had a really hard time coming to grips with that happened when I was 13. Back then I lived in Houston, Texas, in the suburbs. It was a nice, bustling area, and I was always around people, whether in the apartment complex I was in or just going about my day. I was never truly alone. I had a good friend I still frequently talked to called Sarah. Her grandmother lived out in Louisiana, and I had never been one for long road trips, but I thought about having a nice girls' weekend with her, and it would be fun. But I had to bite the bullet and try to enjoy myself for the car ride with her parents, me and her, in a stinky old minivan. Her grandma wasn't the nicest, but she liked me well enough, I think. We were out in the middle of the woods. She was extremely close to the Kisatchie National Forest, so the homes were spread far apart and the woods were vast. The middle of nowhere, to be exact. Her grandma had a thing for people being too close to her, so my friend and I were out in the woods playing and exploring these dense woods behind her property. There was a nice creek here, and the trees seemed to muffle out the outside world. There were birds chirping, we saw lots of wildlife, squirrels, chipmunks, lizards. This forest was crawling with life. It was amazing. Now, we must have been out there for at least 2 hours, because as the sun started to set, we began to get antsy to return back. Her grandma had a huge property. She enjoyed her space, and you must understand, there were no houses or neighbors beside her. She basically spent a fortune on her space. So anyway, we start back and follow the winding creek back up to her house since it was vertical to her place. There's a noise behind us. It sounded like a dog or wolf. I stopped and my friend did too. The noise continued. There's nothing more terrifying than absolute silence and hearing something behind you, following you. We were a ways away, but we both were frozen in fear. I was expecting to hear a coyote or some wild dog, but as the footsteps from the dark drew closer, I hear a ragged breath that sounded less dog and almost human. It started off quiet but grew louder and almost ravenous as it got closer. I slowly turned around as my vision adjusted to the dark. Now it sounded like something was dragging its legs through the leaves, then it stopped. There was more silence. Nothing. No sounds, no panting, nothing. We were both petrified. We were scared now to move an inch, because whatever it was with us and was very close. It could surely outrun and overtake us. Then we both heard the most bizarre sound in our lives. It was a deep, long moan, and it took us both by surprise. I managed to take a quick look at whatever it was. The sound was coming from a tree a few feet from my friend, and I saw it. One hand was gripping the tree, and, through the dusk, I could see paper pale skin and the eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They were wide, and the mouth was like a gaping dead fish. I didn't have time to analyze if it was man, woman, or demon. I just wanted to get out of the woods. The sound stopped as I locked eyes, and I felt my heart stop. My friend managed to tear herself out of the trance we were both in. I grabbed her arm and we booked it. We both started screaming and yelling to hopefully scare off whatever it was. Neither of us heard any noise behind us since we were so pumped on adrenaline, running and screaming, and we didn't stop until we slammed into the back door and locked it. Not 10 minutes after we got back, I demanded to go back home, and my friend was just as shaken up since both of us refused to stay in that house. So we got a hotel at a nearby place, and I left the next day. I tried to be in a good mood for the rest of the time I was there, and honestly it was a great trip, other than that walk in the woods. Her grandma actually died 2 days after we left. Being alone on a crazy property like she was on, I'm surprised a neighbor a few miles away came in to check on her. We're not sure how she died, but my friend and I still have our suspicions. While prospecting out here in the Caribou region, I came across a set of rock piles known as Chinese piles out in the middle of nowhere. These being here Means someone did a lot of digging back in the old days, so I started working, and after half an hour had about 10 grams of gold, and was having a happy dance when I noticed the small standing stones on each rock of the wall as well. Each stone had several Chinese characters on them, and in a moment of dread I realized they were graves. I put the gold in a glass bottle that I found nearby and left it behind. I also took down the drawings of the symbols to show a local historian who later confirmed my suspicions that yes, they were graves, and that they likely hadn't been seen in 150 years. Chinese miners believed that if a miner died on site, the ground became cursed by the fallen miner's spirit, so they wouldn't continue to mine the area and would tell anyone they met that the area was worked out. Sometimes they would also do extra work to make the site look finished, so people wouldn't end up digging their comrades. I've been back several times, but I don't dig there out of respect. The site has a super creepy morning fog. You can almost see the people's outlines sitting around the piles. One of the stories my boss out here told me was when he got involved with some sketchy folk from Prince George back in the 70s. And went with them looking for some mining gear to steal so they could claim jump a site a few kilometers down the road. My boss went down this forgotten path into a clearing with 2 ancient bulldozers and a small cabin. The rest went to the bulldozers to see if they could run, while my boss went into the cabin and was greeted by a skeleton laying on the bed with a bullet hole in his head. They brought in the cops and figured the guy had been there since 1935. Since that was the last date on the newspapers inside. I went to the same cabin with him a few weeks back and found the place had been burnt down by quad biker goons. I was 14 and in the Boy Scouts, and we were on a canoeing trip down to the Buffalo River in Arkansas. It was a 6-day trip, and it was just our little crew of about 10 boys and 3 adults. We'd not seen anyone outside of our crew for days. We would canoe several miles and pick out some random spot to sleep in each night. This one night, me and a friend decided we were not going to sleep in the tent. We wanted to sleep in some hammocks by the river. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night being eaten alive by mosquitoes and decided that this was a stupid idea and began walking to my tent that my tent buddy had set up and was sleeping in without me. The field we chose to camp on that night was quite large, so the tents were spread out very far apart. I'm walking by one of the tents, and I can see this shape huddled up next to it, and assumed it was one of the boys' packs, but it was oddly shaped and it could have been a person. It was very dark and I couldn't see. For some reason I decided to kick it while I was walking past to make sure it was just a bag. When I kicked it, it grunted in pain. It surprised the hell out of me. You must understand that we were supposed to be in the middle of nowhere out in the wilderness, so my first thought was that Adam, the guy who was supposed to be sleeping in the tent, was outside. So I knelt down beside him and asked, "What are you doing out here?" The man replied, "I like you people." That's when my heart nearly exploded out of my chest. This was a stranger. This was not Adam. Fear seized me. I noticed he had a knife in a sheath on his belt loop. I was trying my best to stay calm, and I'll never understand why I thought that I needed that knife away from him. I should have run screaming, but I didn't want to alarm him. I went to grab the knife, and he grabbed my arm and said, "You need to go to bed." "Okay," I say, and I got up and walked the remaining 100 or so feet to my tent. I woke up my tent mate damn near hysterical, just knowing he was going to come in any second to try and kill us. I woke him up and told him the story, and he, being much braver than I, went out there and walked around and came back and said he didn't see anyone, and he thought I was making up the whole thing. The next morning when I woke up, the adults wanted to talk to me. I walk out of the tent, and I see people's stuff strewn everywhere. Apparently the guy, whoever he was going outside each tent and going through the backpacks looking for stuff to steal. One of the adults had an expensive camera missing. The adults went and searched for signs that someone else was on this part of the river but never found anyone or anything. To date, this is the scariest moment of my life, and though I'm 36 now, my wife mocks me, because I still sleep with a nightlight. A family was camping and their golden retriever brought a human femur, with an artificial hip joint attached to it out of the woods. I was a rural cop who handled the case. We ran the serial number on the hip, and it came back to a woman who had been reported missing in the area about 15 years prior. Multiple theories had been put forward, but her body and vehicle had never been recovered. We organized a search party to recover the remains, and were able to locate both her remains, the vehicle, and solve the case. There was a section of highway about 2 miles north of the campsite where the dog found the femur. It made a sharp turn and had about a 50-foot drop into a heavily forested basin. Her vehicle left the road and crashed at the bottom of the cliff, killing her. Scavenger animals then spread the remains over a wide area in the basin. It is a remote area and nobody would have witnessed the crash, and the car wouldn't be visible from the top of the cliffs. So she and her car had been missing 15 years, and it was only sitting 50 feet off the road the entire time. My husband, kids and I live out in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that's about 100 acres. I'd say probably 95 of those acres are wilderness, with ATV and hiking trails that we and several of the previous owners created by exploring. We use much of that land for camping, hiking and hunting. We like to find a spot, clear it a bit, and camp overnight. There's so much space that we never stayed in the same place twice. We've seen some kill sites, both old and fresh, lots of animal tracks and places where deer bed down. I've even spent a lot of time solo hiking, while the kids are in school and my husband's at work. Whether alone or with the family, we always carry firearms for protection. Well, a few years ago we decided to load up our camping gear and start a new trail. We mark the trails we make with spray paint on trees. We're pretty far into the woods, having hiked almost an hour, when the atmosphere seemed to change. I don't know who noticed it first, but my husband, who was leading the three of us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping, the insects were quiet, and there were no sounds around us. When, in the woods, complete quietness is rarely a good thing. We continued onwards, hyper-aware of our surroundings, while our kids continued merrily talking. We came to the stream that marks the midway point of our property, and stopped for a few minutes. My husband and I, in a stare down with each other, both felt like something was off but didn't want to scare our daughter. I finally broke the silence and said that I didn't feel good and that we should go home. My husband nodded in agreement while our daughter voiced her protest. Too bad, kiddo. We turned around and started back. After going a few hundred yards, still in the silent wilderness, I looked to my right and saw a person crouched down in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off our trail. I'm positive they saw that I noticed them, but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention when he looked back. I put my hand on the gun in the holster on my hip, which caused him to readjust his rifle in preparation for anything. I split up my family and we hurried back home. I told my husband as soon as we were inside, and we decided to call the police and report the trespasser. We filed a report and was told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone to set up a bunch of deer cams. We didn't go back out into the woods for maybe a week. Then he and I ventured out to retrieve the cam footage. Out of the 9 cams we placed, we caught a person in a ghillie suit in 2 images. We handed the copies over to the cops to go with our report. We haven't gone back since, except to check out the deer cams, and haven't gotten any other trespassers. It freaks me out even more to think of the few times while camping that we heard walking near our tent in the middle of the night, and always assumed it was a curious animal. But now, I'm not so sure. And my best advice to anyone is to always carry protection. If you're uncomfortable with guns, consider bear mace. If you have kids, consider a gun. It's always much easier to protect them from a bear or dangerous animal than a human with nefarious intentions with a gun. and it allows ample distance to remain between you and a threat. We later found out who it was. It was someone who had worked for my husband, who had been fired for misconduct. He apparently had a thing for me, and sent me some incredibly graphic and inappropriate texts, which resulted in his being fired. We found out it was him after he broke into our shed in the ghillie suit and stole some stuff. We had a camera facing the shed and captured him completely, but didn't know it was him until he tried to pawn something that had a serial number registered to us. The pawn shop notified us, and we notified the police. I was 15 years old at the time of this occurrence. I lived in a very remote area in Montana. All that is around is plains, towns, and farmland, and of course some trees. Me and my family moved here from another town in Montana about 5 years ago, and we never had any problems with our neighbors before, up until today. My brother had a friend over at the time, Alex. My brother and Alex were going to go on a bike ride pretty early in the morning to Alex's old neighborhood, and then my brother happened to get a headache, so I decided to go for a ride with Alex because I felt bad that my brother couldn't go. I thought it would be a quick bike ride with Alex to his old house. It took about an hour to ride there. He lived on a road called Heaven's View. It was the way he was talking to me about his insane old neighbor who charged at Alex with a knife, and many more odd occurrences. Alex's family even had to go to court over how the neighbors acted. He also told me that his neighbor was a felon. This part is really interesting. We checked out his old house. It was actually pretty nice. I'm not gonna lie, I took a glimpse at his neighbor's house. It wasn't half bad, like nicer than any house I'd lived in, but I didn't think much of it. Me and Alex started to head back. Keep in mind, both of us did not have our phones on us. We were riding on the gravel road and had nothing but washboards under it. We noticed this red Ford F-150 coming at us, so Alex and I pull over. The truck is centimeters away from hitting us, when Alex looks at me with a terrified expression that actually freaked me out. "What is it?" "It's them," says Alex. I instantly knew what he was talking about. It was the psycho neighbors. I look in my rear view on my bike and see the truck whipping around quickly. My heart started to race as I signal Alex to book it ahead. We start going very fast and I see a four-way, gravel on one side, pavement on the other, and I pull up next to Alex and tell him to turn last second on the gravel on the right. I turn around and the guy driving was a really skinny-looking dude with his hood up. I was so terrified. We turned instantly and the guy in the truck almost hits a tree, but he got wound up in the ditch. We saw a big bush to hide behind in the driveway. The guy thankfully did not see us go into the driveway as he stopped right next to the bush and drove away. A really sweet old lady came out and she texted my dad on her phone to come and pick me and Alex up. My dad gets there and we put our bikes in the back of the truck and go back to my house. On the way back, we see the truck speed ahead, and Alex is frantically telling my dad that he's the guy who tried to chase us. My dad tries to speed up, but the truck was too fast and got away. I know for a fact my dad would have kicked his teeth in for chasing a 13 and 15-year-old, and I've learned to never go down into that neighborhood again. Nothing else has ever happened since this encounter, and I'm glad about it. In the April of 2016, I had done 9 days on the Appalachian Trail, and it was truly life-changing. So I had the camping bug bad. The whole year I was hammock camping any possible chance I got. The farm I grew up on sits on a hill overlooking a creek bottom area where tobacco and soybean are grown, an area of outstanding natural beauty, and the creek looks more like a small river at times. This is an area where arrowheads are often found, just a mile away. An Indian burial ground was excavated when I was in 4th grade, where the high school sits now. I remember it very well, and it was a half-mile walking distance from my home. Our driveway at one time had been a country road, but it dead-ended on our property, so who knows when that happened. At one time, it was a well-traveled route, probably back when the country was originally settled. After all, it was only a mile as the crow flies from the country seat. The old road cuts deep into the hills, and there's a little offshoot gravel road that diverges off it that goes down to the creek bottom in front of our house. I was feeling nostalgic and decided I was going to camp in the creek bottom at the end of the old gravel road. This is something we had done often in that general area, as it felt as familiar to me as the back of my hand. There was an old barn that stood there when I was a little kid, but has since been destroyed, and I decided to make my camp on the opposite side of the road at the edge of the bottom. I'm not going as far as I usually did. I made a little fire, set up my hammock, and chewed on a snack that I'd brought with me. For some reason I wasn't feeling all that comfortable. I was trying to settle down into the idea, but I was really ill at ease. Keep in mind, this is a place that is basically my parents' front yard, maybe a quarter of a mile from my front door. I grew up here, and I've played in this very spot since I was a small child, but nonetheless I was feeling extremely uncomfortable. I did 9 days on the Appalachian Trail without any feelings like what I was experiencing at that very moment. I was determined to stay down there and laughed at myself. It was a pretty calm and quiet night, when all of a sudden the biggest gust of wind blew through camp, out of a complete calm. I was basically surrounded by clumps of trees nestled up against a hill at the corner of a bottom. It was really odd for a gust of wind to come in where I was. If you could see the topography, you would understand why I'm saying this. Then I started to realize a heavy sense of foreboding. It felt like I wasn't alone and that I was being watched. I was still trying to rationalize it all when all of a sudden I heard a few deep snorting sounds, as if they were in my general vicinity, at the most 15 feet away. But I heard no footsteps, no rustling, just snorts, and I thought to myself, it had to be a buck, but why didn't I hear it moving? The hair on the back of my neck was standing up straight, and I decided it was time to go. I packed up everything, doused the fire, and immediately walked up the hill. I felt like the whole time I was taking camp down that something was very agitated with me, and that I had to get out of there immediately. It was a very intense feeling, and it didn't subside until I was at least 50 feet away from where I was camping. This wasn't the only time I've had this kind of experience, but that's another story. If I'd have just read this on the internet, I wouldn't believe it, but the fact that it happened to me, well, this happened a number of years ago. I was walking in the Canadian forest, nowhere near any towns or even roads. I'm going to estimate that it's at least 200 kilometers in, or 120 miles, when I come across something very unexpected. A grizzly bear that has been crucified. Now, this isn't a tiny baby bear. This is a good 600 kilograms or 1,320 pound bear. So it's not your average size grizzly, although not the biggest I've seen. It was 30 feet up the tree. That was by far the most we should get the hell out of here moment I've ever felt. I still have no clue how they would have done that, and why they did it so far out into the wilderness. It still gives me the creeps just thinking about it. As you can imagine, I didn't stick around long, and left shortly after seeing it. But there are some things you see out in the woods that you never forget. I am a 25-year-old female, and I've been spending a decent chunk of time in the stand with my partner hunting, because we've discovered that hogs have been rooting up the oats and generally causing havoc and scaring away the deer from the feeder. We've gone out a handful of times in the last 2 weeks, attempting to catch the miscreants at it. So far no luck. Very frustrating. At any rate, because of the hogs, I've been spending more time in this stand after dark than I ever have in my life. We've been up there from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m., 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., 9 p.m. to 11 p.m., and every other weird time slot you can think of. I mention this to help you paint a picture. There have been a few things that have happened that I've struggled to explain away or rationalize. The first was about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. It was around 2 in the morning, with a decent chunk of moon illuminating the area. I was only half paying attention to my surroundings because I'd already written the night off as a bust when all of a sudden I became aware of a weird whirring/flapping sound. I thought it originated from somewhere behind me, but my partner said he heard it coming from away and to the front or left of us. At any rate, it was loud, airborne, and passed quickly over us and away. I'm very familiar with the sound drones make, and that wasn't it. It wasn't a helicopter either. The sound was too small. It sounded too mechanical. It was flying very low, probably just above the tree line, and we couldn't see anything. The second thing happened about a week ago. We weren't in the stand, but it was weird and out of the norm. We live on the same property that the stand is on. It was around 9 or 10 when all of a sudden there was a distant boom like an explosion, which hit our home like a thud. If you've ever spent any time around heavy artillery or explosives, you'll know what I mean. It was strong enough that my sister-in-law, who lives down the road, called us asking what the hell happened. It could have just been a natural gas explosion, but the weird part is that my partner did some internet digging, and a local emergency management website had posted asking for any info on an unknown explosion back in 2016, during the same time of year. So we still have no clue what it is. And then lastly, tonight. We were out on the stand once again. It's gotten cold and we'd had a ton of rain all day, so everything was damp and dripping. We went out at 10, and it was about 10:30. I was preoccupied with trying to keep my fingers and toes warm, when suddenly I became aware of a very weird murmuring. My partner heard it too, but he has hearing damage, so I don't think he heard the full breadth of the tones. To me, it sounded like muffled voices off in the distance, like several people having a conversation too far off to make out the individual words. But the direction the sounds were coming from didn't have any buildings or dwellings, it was just woods, and there are several different tones. My partner said it sounded like a cow moaning, but not quite. There are cattle in the area and we hear them vocalizing all the time, and this wasn't it. And there isn't any grazing land in the vicinity of the original sound. They carried for maybe 30 seconds, rose in a crescendo and then died off and faded away completely. I want to stress how indistinct these sounds were. If I hadn't been listening intently, I don't know if I'd have heard it. All of this coupled with the general gut feeling I have whenever I'm out in the dark alone, and it has me wondering. I don't necessarily feel endangered, just generally watched and noticed. I have very good instincts, and I try to listen to them. I'd love to know what you all think. Maybe there's a rational explanation. I also want to clarify that I'm no noob in the woods. I spent most of my life outdoors and I grew up camping and hiking during almost all my time of year. Sleeping on the ground in a tent, you get used to hearing the sounds of nature. I spent 6 years in active military duty and have been exposed to some military-grade technology and what that might look and sound like. Obviously, there's top-secret stuff hardly anyone ever sees, but still. I've also worked during all hours of the day and night outside, and this is the first time in my life that anything out of the ordinary has ever happened, because nothing ever happens when I'm around. I'm a paramedic, and it was a late summer night. We responded to a call in a rural area. My partner and I were driving down a winding 2-lane highway in the middle of nowhere. No lights of any kind other than headlights and moon. We're coming up on a sharp right turn when I see a man traveling across the grass from an area of brush. He's moving very quickly and smoothly, as if he's hauling ass on a bicycle. No up and down motion like running. Obviously, I'm pretty confused about a hillbilly on a bike in the middle of the night, but I'm not surprised. He comes to a tree and stops. It's about this time we're driving by him. Look out of the window and I see a man standing next to this tree with no bike or anything in sight. Just standing there, staring at the truck passing by. My hair is standing on end and we continue towards the call, and I ask my partner if he'd seen the guy. His response was, "Man, I thought I was crazy." He could have been freakishly fast running, or an old school ghost riding his bike. What made it so freaky was the speed that he floated across the gravel, and the abrupt stop and then the stare. I've been doing this for years, and it's the only thing that's ever happened to me that can come close as paranormal. Adding to the creep factor was that we were miles from any house, store, or bar. When I was a theatre study student in the Midlands of England, we had to take our little theatre company on tour around the local rural countryside as part of the practical side of the course. Being a proper London girl, I wasn't the best pleased with the prospect of roughing it in a 10-person van, as there were 15 of us in the company, but for the sake of art, I stopped being silly and threw myself in with the enthusiasm. One day we broke down in the middle of nowhere, and by the time the AA got to us, and in turn, by the time we got to the campsite, all the spaces in the campsite had been taken. We had 3 performances locally the next day. It had gone 8 PM and it was almost pitch black, and we didn't have many options left to us. Our director said it would be best if we drove the van to the nearest forest and all slept in the van for the night, as it was too late to continue driving and to have an early start the following day. We reluctantly agreed. We found a quiet part of the forest that was open, with not many trees, by 9:30. We were settled in the van, if a little cramped and cold, and we were all 19 and 20. It was a big adventure. Around 11:30 I was stirred awake by one of my colleagues screaming and another bloke saying, "This is so bad, we're screwed." To my complete horror, through my sleep-blurred eyes, I saw our little van was completely surrounded by about 50 men, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned rural farming clothes with homemade torches all burning brightly. I started panicking but didn't scream and couldn't take my eyes off the men. They weren't moving. They didn't have any expression on their faces. 2 of the blokes even got out of the van and shouted at them, to the total horror of everyone else, but nothing. Needless to say, we were all terrified. Every time we tried to move the van, the men moved a step forward. At 1:30, all the men suddenly just turned around and walked away through the trees. We were absolutely knackered, too tired to drive anywhere else, so we took turns in keeping watch, in case the men came back, but they never did. Me and my assorted group of friends from different branches of the military here, stateside, like to go camping on one of the neighbours' farms. All of us have some level of firearm training, carry guns with us, as this is important later, and we bed down for the night. It's not 2 hours later when we all wake up to screaming and gunshots. We make a perimeter and secure it. We try and figure out what the hell just happened. In a word, wolves. But the kicker was that one of them appeared to have red eyes with a solid black coat. Of course, the wolves got scared of the guns and scattered. The kicker? I will still camp out there with the others that didn't swear the place off. I will see the pack on and off when I go. Turns out the black-haired wolf is still out there. I was passed out in my hammock one night at 2 AM in a familiar area I've hiked and camped at for years, and suddenly I'm wide awake and buzzing like someone with way too much caffeine in their system. Think stacking a monster with a pre-workout. I dropped out of my hammock and took a look around. I don't see anything odd. I don't hear anything at all, which is weird because the woods are never quiet. Everything feels heavy, very oppressive, and my brain tells me to get out of there, tearing down, stuffing everything into my pack. I also did something I've never done before, while hiking, grab my holster and pistol and clip it to my pack. I always conceal, but that night, I noticed a barely audible, very high-pitched whine, but I couldn't figure out in which direction it was coming from. I haul ass about a half-mile down the trail back towards the trailhead in the car, and then it stopped. I felt fine, panic went down, and I was hearing normal things in the woods, and the whole feeling of oppression ceased. I don't know what happened. Was it a sleep disturbance leading to an anxiety attack on both times? I've read exposure to electromagnetic fields causes such a reaction. Was it something supernatural? I have absolutely no clue. Some searches led me to learn that it could be a phenomena, maybe even infrasound. Whatever the case, I'm glad I left. When I was 13, I was extremely dumb. One day, I was out with some friends. I was on holiday, and I'd only just met these people, and we decided to go into the woods. The woods are huge, and it's pretty much a death trap since there are many ditches. And being dumb kids, we went in at around 6 or 7 when our curfew was 9. We were warned from the start not to go in them. My buddy runs ahead to an old cabin that seemed empty, so we went in and took a look around. Now here's where it gets interesting. We hear a creaking in one of the rooms. By now, one of the girls there was in tears, thinking some mass murderer was in there preparing to kill us. My buddy, who had discovered the cabin, was 15 at the time, so went ahead as he slowly creaked open the door and could see a rocking chair moving with no one in it. Classic horror movie moment, but we noped out of there ASAP and never told anyone what happened. We didn't even want to tell them where we went. I just know that I'd never want to return. This happened a year ago. I was at my cousin's house. Her house is literally at the end of a village and surrounded by forest, and we decided that we should go into the forest and have a kind of trip. Anyway, we started walking in the forest, and we get to this part of the forest which weirdly gets really dark once you enter it, which is already strange. So from what I knew at the time, once you entered the dark place, you're about, 3 meters in, and you come across a beautiful lake. So we go there, and instead of a lake, we came across a mass grave of sheep. Yes, sheep. The lake was fully gone, and now there was a mass grave of sheep. I still don't know why they were there, but we never returned. It was primitive camping, but there were still a few people in the area. I was sleeping in a hammock for the first time. I set it up across a babbling brook so that I could listen to the water all night. Because I felt so exposed, every little noise would wake me up, and any time a larger rock tumbled in the water, it brought me awake and questioned whether it was a wolf or something. The weird part happened at about 3 to 4 a.m. I woke up again and could hear an angelic choir off in the distance, like a choir of people not really singing words but just tones in a harmony. Is there a logical explanation for it? Sure. I wasn't really scared, but it just brought up images of some cult in the middle of nowhere doing weird stuff. I fell back asleep not long after, and in the morning, no one else had heard it. Not surprising, considering how much they drank. I just wonder why a choir would be out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, practicing their tunes. Unless it was something else, of course. A friend and I were hiking several miles to camp in the wilderness. It started raining with sleet. It's about 35 Fahrenheit and late afternoon. We're about 9 miles in, and there are no connecting trails near this one, when we see an older guy walking towards us on the trail. The first person we've seen since starting. He's got zero equipment, is soaking wet and wearing tennis shoes, t-shirt and jeans. He slurred, "It's beautiful out here. Very quiet, and the colors." The closest town is backwoods and known for drugs and meth. My friends and I have a few $1,000s worth of hiking/camping equipment on us, and we get nervous talking to him and start walking away. He followed us for 50 yards back for another 3 miles, and then we didn't see him again. We didn't get much sleep that night, wondering if he was still around and what he may do to get our gear. As a younger kid with uncaring parents, I'd explore outside a lot, living in a relatively rural area with no civilization for miles. Once I stumbled across an abandoned barn, which had burns all over it, and a large hole in the roof, as if some large object had crashed straight through it. That's not even the weird part. There were pristine baby clothes out, without a wrinkle, that were neatly folded around the entrance of the barn. I still to this day have no clue why those would be there, especially in such an extremely unpopulated rural area. Could it be a homeless person or family? If so, why would they need baby clothes? Definitely absurd. I lived on a large cattle station in New South Wales, Australia, until I was 16. A few years before we left, my dad and I were out looking for a few lost cattle in the back paddocks, which back onto quite steep rocky mountains. We were crossing a shallow creek when our horses started snorting and getting flighty. There was movement above us, high in the trees. My horse started rearing, and just as Dad reached over to grab my reins to settle the horse down, something big and grey dropped from the tree right between us. Our horses took off in opposite directions. I took all my strength to pull my horse up, and Dad eventually came out to me and was quite anxious about getting us away from there. I asked him what was wrong. What was it? It was a roo, he said. It had been gutted and dead a while by the smell. He threw another look over his shoulder and got us moving a bit quicker. I heard him mutter to himself, "How the hell did the body get up the tree?" He never went out without a gun after that day. There are stories about big cats in the Australian bush, and it's the only explanation that we could ever come up with. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, don't forget to download our app to hear even more stories ad-free. Oh, and another thing, huge thanks to my members and patrons who contribute every month to help keep the channel running. It means a lot, it goes a hell of a long way, and I love you all forever. Tonight I had fun with these stories. If you did, again, please leave a like and a comment. That's always really appreciated. It goes a long way. I do try and read all of them and reply to as many as I can. Nature Week is almost at an end. There are one or two more topics I can do. They never perform as well. I'd love to do cave stories, rural cave stories, but I'm afraid right now there is simply not enough material. But I should have something fun for you tomorrow. But until then, guys, I'm going to bid you all adieu. Stay awesome. Another video, if you want to see, is on screen, by the way, if you still want more. And I'll see you in the next one.